Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is raising a glass, a toast, a sip, a quiet drink alone after a long day. It feels like nothing, a habit, a ritual at most, but what you're doing when you drink is older than language, older than fire, older than the human brain that's currently enjoying it. Because the story of alcohol doesn't begin with the Romans and their wine or the Mesopotamians and their grain. It begins somewhere in Africa, tens of millions of years ago, with a primate that had no idea what it was about to start. Here's what we know. Ripe fruit, when it falls from a tree and sits in the heat, doesn't just rot. It transforms. Wild yeasts in the air land on the sugars inside, consume them, and produce ethanol as a byproduct. It's fermentation, and it happens on its own without any help from anyone. Our earliest primate ancestors ate that fruit, and something about it made them feel different. Warmer, calmer, slightly altered. They didn't know why, but they came back for it. A biologist named Robert Dudley at UC Berkeley spent years studying this phenomenon and proposed what he called the drunken monkey hypothesis. His argument is that our attraction to alcohol isn't cultural or learned. It's evolutionary. Over millions of years, the primates who were drawn to the smell and taste of fermented fruit found more calories, more ripe food, and survived longer. The ones who weren't as interested, they didn't pass that trait on. So by the time Homo sapiens showed up, a pull toward alcohol was already baked into the biology. We didn't develop a taste for it. We inherited one. But knowing you're drawn to something and actually being able to make it on purpose, that's a different leap entirely. So the question becomes, when did humans figure out how to brew? The answer is earlier than almost anyone expected. In 2021, researchers analyzing remains from a site in southern Israel found chemical evidence of fermented grain production dating back roughly 13,000 years. The people doing this were Natufians, semi-nomadic foragers who had not yet invented agriculture. They weren't farmers. They had no permanent settlements. They collected wild grain by hand, hunted animals, and moved with the seasons. And yet they were brewing. Not accidentally. Deliberately. With stone vessels carved for the purpose. The fermented residue was identified through analysis of plant microfossils and chemical compounds that only appear when starch converts to alcohol. Someone, 13,000 years ago, understood enough about the process to repeat it intentionally. That finding flips something we thought we understood. For a long time, the standard story was linear. Humans settled down, started farming, built villages, and eventually, as a kind of bonus, figured out that fermented drinks were possible. Alcohol was a product of civilization. But the Natufian evidence suggests it might work the other way around. Around the same period in what is now southeastern Turkey, people were doing something even harder to explain. At a site called Göbekli Tepe, hunter-gatherers with no permanent homes organized the labor necessary to quarry, transport, and erect stone pillars, some of them weighing more than 10 tons, and carve them with elaborate animal imagery. No farming, no settled society. No obvious reason to do this at all. When archaeologists found large stone basins at the site and analyzed their interiors, they found residue from fermented grain. Evidence that suggests this wasn't just a monument. It was a gathering place. People were traveling from across a wide region to come together, feast, and drink. Which raises a question that archaeologists have been arguing about ever since. Why did humans start farming? The obvious answer is food security. Grow your own grain, you eat more reliably. But an anthropologist and archaeochemist named Patrick McGovern, who has spent decades tracking the chemical fingerprints of ancient alcohol, has pushed a different theory. He argues that the desire to produce alcohol consistently and reliably was one of the primary drivers behind the shift to agriculture. You can't brew at scale if you're collecting wild grain by hand every season. To make enough, you need to grow it. You need fields, storage, planning, and permanence. If McGovern is right, beer didn't come after civilization. Beer might have been the reason civilization got started. By around 7000 BCE, the evidence stops being theoretical. In central China, at a Neolithic village called Jiahu, pottery vessels were found containing residue from a fermented beverage made from rice, honey, grapes, and wild fruit. Chemical analysis confirmed both the ingredients and the fermentation. This is the oldest confirmed alcoholic recipe in the world, and it isn't simple. It's a blend. A deliberate combination of multiple ingredients to create a specific effect. The people who made this weren't stumbling into fermentation by accident. They knew what they were doing. From there, the scale only grows. By the time ancient Egypt was raising pyramids, alcohol wasn't a luxury or a leisure product. It was infrastructure. Workers on the Giza Plateau received daily rations of beer. Records suggest somewhere between 4 and 5 liters per person. Not as a bonus, not as a treat, as payment, as sustenance. The Nile water was frequently contaminated, and the brewing process involving boiling and fermentation produced a drink that was safer to consume than the river water people would otherwise be drinking. Beer kept the workforce alive. Beyond that, it carried religious weight. The Egyptians associated beer with Osiris and included it in temple offerings and burial rituals. Physicians prescribed it as a delivery mechanism for herbal remedies. In a single vessel, beer was doing the work of currency, nutrition, water purification, medicine, and spiritual practice simultaneously. So here's the actual timeline. Tens of millions of years ago, primate ancestors developed a biological draw toward fermented fruit. 13,000 years ago, humans were deliberately brewing before they had invented farming. 12,000 years ago, they may have been constructing the first large ceremonial monuments in history with fermented grain as the centerpiece. 9,000 years ago, they had specific recipes. 5,000 years ago, entire economies were running on production and distribution of alcohol. This wasn't something that emerged after humans built the world. There's a serious case to be made that it was part of the reason they did. Every time you take a drink, wine at dinner, a beer on a Friday, whatever it is, you're participating in something that stretches back further than agriculture, further than cities, further than writing. The vessel changed. The ingredients changed. The setting changed. But the impulse is the same one that had a small primate reaching for overripe fruit on a forest floor long before it had a word for anything. We just got a lot better at making it on purpose.